Hello friends, welcome back to another video and welcome to the channel where for the entire month of June we're focusing on queer authors for Pride Month. And in case you weren't aware, this is actually a part 2 to a video that I posted yesterday. I'm in the process of reading Edie Windsor's memoir. It focuses on gay life in the 50s and 60s in New York, and I made it roughly 50% through the book in that video, but I decided to cut it short and split it into 2 parts for my own well-being. So if you missed that, I would definitely recommend checking that out first because we're just going to jump back into it. I got from the beginning through chapter 11, so this is just going to be picking up right where that left off, and we're just gonna keep talking about some gay history. Again, the quick disclaimers that I suck at history, I don't know what I'm talking about. This is just my summary of what I understood from the book, but there's a lot that I don't understand or that I'm gonna explain wrong, and all of this is gonna sound a whole lot better coming from the voice of the person who experienced it, so if you're able to read the book for yourself, I definitely recommend that you do. I'm just making these videos to keep these stories circulating, so if you don't have access or if you've never heard of these books before, maybe you'll give them a try. With that being said, let's jump right back into it. Hello, welcome to Update Time. So in part 1 of this video, we talked about chapters 1 to 11, which in my head I kind of grouped as early life and then embracing the gay. So just the initial setup and then finally recognizing this other part of herself and fully diving into that world. And then chapters 9 to 11 were kind of Thea begins. This is the start of that relationship that ended up meaning so much in history. I think this next section I'm gonna call domestic life. And it's sort of wrapped up between chapters 12 and 15. In this time, life was good for the two of them. Their relationship was thriving, they had good jobs, they had good friendships, everything was just kind of working out in this time of their lives. Thea chose their first big destination trip. This was kind of the make or break moment of any relationship where you go on your first big trip and you see how the other person acts. You see how the two of you interact in a completely new environment, and that sort of defines their relationship. And it ended up working out beautifully for them because while they were on this trip, Thea made sure to plan it to make it the best experience possible, but their boat flipped over while they were in the water, and Thea ended up saving Eddie's life, basically. And Eddie said, okay, well, you're responsible for me for the rest of my life now. But because people weren't accepting, they were like, how are we going to talk about this with other people without them getting suspicious? And they decided that Eddie would pretend to date Thea's brother, who is not real. Just another story so that they could hang out and have it not seem like a weird thing. And it also touches on how in history at this time gay men were starting to do sit-ins at bars, similarly to how people of color would sit and request drinks. For a while it was a thing where you weren't supposed to serve gay men because they were seen as disorderly. So they would peacefully sit in at bars and they would just wait for drinks, which eventually led to the Supreme Court saying that as long as they're not being disorderly, as long as they're not being disruptive, you can serve them. But during this time, Eddie wasn't ready to add her voice to that conversation. She was content, she was happy with where she was at. And again, that's a completely fine and respectable thing. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of self-preservation. We do need the people that are standing up and making a difference and risking it all, but you can't expect that from people because that's a really hard thing to ask. They were getting each other extravagant gifts like a motorcycle. Thea stopped being so all over other people. She became really super devoted to this specific relationship. And at the end of this perfect summer, Thea proposed. But they had already talked about it and they decided that they couldn't just go around wearing rings because that would be a dead giveaway that something is going on. And if they were to announce that they were engaged, people would say, oh, can I see your husband? And that opens up a whole other conversation. So instead of getting a ring, Thea proposed with a pin. So it's a subtle reminder of the person without being super obvious to people who shouldn't be knowing. In chapter 14, they got a 10-room apartment. I have no clue if I read that right. That sounds insane, but it was $600 a month. They got this apartment together and they also got a little summer house for vacation time, for off time. But even in that place, which was supposed to be a happy, safe place, they still couldn't fully express themselves. They couldn't announce, hey, we're here together. And they both knew that they loved each other and they were proud to be together, but they were afraid. And in my notes here, I wrote that in the previous video, I had talked about how I was bored of the constant back and forth that Eddie had with relationships, where she would be with a partner and then decide it's too much work, and then she'd be with a guy and then decide that she wasn't into it, and then go back to being with a girl and go back and forth with them, and then getting with Thea, but then she would cheat and then they would go back and forth. I said that I was getting a little bit bored of reading about that, but such a big focus of this book is Eddie's love life, so obviously it makes sense that we're talking about it, and I think now it's finally coming together. You're seeing it work out, you're seeing it have a happy ending where now they are comfortably living together. In 1969, Thea proposed that they go to Italy for Eddie's 40th birthday. They felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be, with career, with friends, with relationships, with money, everything. Again, it was just working out great. These were the happy years. And the only issue was that they couldn't be public about their relationship. That was the one flaw in their lives. While they were in Italy, they had no clue what was going on back at home, but the Stonewall riots were happening. The Stonewall riots were a series of spontaneous protests by members of the gay community in response to a police raid on a queer space. This was a big deal, but they were in another country and they had no idea. And when they came back home, they didn't know anything had happened, but they looked around and they sensed the energy. They saw more queer people in the streets, and eventually they learned what happened. It was something that was impossible when Edie first moved to New York, and seeing all of these people fighting so hard, she was in awe. She was so amazed, and she decided that she had to be a part of this. And this chapter does also acknowledge that she was privileged and she had a lot of money, which most queer people didn't. Most of the people that were attacked in the police raid, it was a lot of homeless queer kids. It's really brutal, and this chapter addresses that they had a lot of money. Like, they were able to do good for themselves, and they were able to pretend to be straight and just live life as normal. And there was a weird divide in the gay community with people who were able to do that and people who had to struggle no matter what. People who had no other option. But when these riots started and when people started fighting, that's when everybody kind of came together for this big goal. I titled the next section, "The Spark Has Been Lit," because from here on, she is trying to figure out how she can impact this whole movement. How can she make a difference? We'll get to that very soon. I know I said this next section was going to be focusing on the spark has been lit and now we're into the activism portion, but it doesn't last long. Chapter 16 talks about the things that they did when they started getting more into the world of gay rights. They still weren't ready to be out, they weren't ready to openly talk about their relationship, but they did what they could to kind of anonymously support other groups or donation centers or anything like that. Because they had a lot of money, they were more privileged, they were able to give that money to people who needed it. And in doing that, they sort of created their own family, a little found family moment where they were able to take care of people who needed it, and it just generally created a positive environment in which everybody could boost each other up. They built themselves a solid social circle, and it says, "Life was more than just good. We were having the best time ever." This was in the early 70s, where not only were people fighting for gay rights, but they were fighting for sexual liberation, as well as a second wave of feminism. Sometimes those things went against each other. For example, somebody that was in charge of this whole feminism thing was saying anti-lesbian things. She was saying that that invalidated their efforts, that it discredited the work of being a woman, and that you're focusing on the wrong things. Edie was pretty hurt by this rejection, as you would be, because you can be both a woman and a lesbian. They don't. She felt pretty hurt by this rejection, and because of that, she kind of distanced herself from the term feminist. In 1975, she was able to retire early, and she fantasized about how she was going to use her free time to work for gay rights. Thea bought them an apartment that they could live in together, so they didn't have to worry about having to move out. They now had a solid place. Life was good. And as for their personal relationship things, the book says that they fought like any other couple, but they also figured out ways to communicate with each other. One of the main things being, when they were getting heated, when they were getting frustrated with each other, they would say a number of 1 to 10, here's how bad this argument is getting. And if it was a higher enough number, they would both acknowledge, okay, we need to take a minute and calm down. So as much as you can look to this relationship and everything that it was, and you can kind of idolize it and see it as this perfect thing, you have to remember that they were also people. They had little arguments, they had weird disagreements and gross conversations. Like, they're still regular people at the end of all of this. And I thought that was going to be the start of a hopeful section in which you see all of these great things that they end up doing, but I was immediately knocked down. The next section, I have titled it, "Health is Hard." Chapters 17 to 20, and probably throughout the rest of this book, are very focused on health. But specifically these chapters, things don't go so good for the people in Edie's life. Chapter 17 starts by saying that Thea was having leg problems, where she would just accidentally get her leg caught in something and she would trip and fall. And then they noticed that this was becoming a pattern where she would randomly just fall over and she couldn't catch herself, or she started losing strength in her hands, or different body functions were just not happening the way that they should. And Edie kept saying, hey, please go to a doctor, you should probably get this checked out, but Thea kept making excuses, saying it's not a big deal, it'll go away, it's just an old childhood thing, it's fine. And she also blamed it on age, saying this is just what happens when you get older. Around this time, when they started to see things getting bad, Eddie's mom had a heart attack and died. And on the day of her passing, Edie was gonna go to the hospital to go visit her mom. Thea said, please let me come with you, and Edie said, no, you're gonna go to a hospital and you're gonna get this figured out because I can't lose you both. She goes to visit her mom for one last time, and while she's there, she thinks about how if she were to come out as gay to her mom, she probably would have been accepted. Her mom probably would have maybe had some questions. sure, but she wouldn't have disowned her child because ultimately there was just love. Thea's health was declining, and Edie was still smoking cigarettes, and now her health is declining. And Thea said an ultimatum. She said, "We can't both be dying right now, so either you give up cigarettes or you leave me." So Edie made the decision. She quit cigarettes. It took a lot of work. It took a couple tries with the program, but eventually she did it because ultimately this relationship is the most important thing. And Thea also got diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, which is an immune system issue where it eats away at the protective covering of your nerves, and it doesn't really get better. So over time, they're seeing her health decline, and Thea says, "Hey, I don't want to drag you down. Feel free to leave me at any time." But Eddie's in this for however long it takes. She wants to be there. She loves her unconditionally. They're gonna stick together through this. And then, on top of all of that, AIDS. With all the personal stuff that's going on, now AIDS is sweeping the nation. All of their gay male friends are dying. The one good thing about that is the divide between gay men and lesbians was kind of closed up because a lot of lesbians during this time took care of gay men when everybody else was too afraid to. Super big thing in history was just how great lesbians were during this time. It also mentioned that this guy was their downstairs neighbor, which was cool. But everybody was banding together, doing as much as they could, and Edie, because she had a whole background with computer stuff, this was obviously before computers were so common, but she had knowledge about basic programming and stuff like that, and she recognized how helpful that would be. So she did what she could to set up systems to help queer programs. She only really got into activism in the 80s and beyond, and I thought that was so interesting, and it's so refreshing to read about because there are so many people talking about how when you are a woman, after a certain age, you lose value, and that's so not true, and it's so nice to read a story where that isn't true, where yes, as a young woman, she was attractive and she had a lot of job opportunities and she was really smart and she was really good at a lot of things, but the things that she was known for didn't happen until she was in her 70s and beyond. Like, so much of her life she was just living, and then she got to an age and she decided she's gonna make a difference, and it just shows that it's never too late to do stuff like that. Chapter 19 starts off by saying that the stock market crashed in 1987 and Edie had to go get her job back. That only lasted for 3 years before Thea had to go to a wheelchair and Edie had to quit her job. She had to retire once again to be able to take care of Thea. Around this time, 1990, her brother's health was also declining, and he ended up passing too. It's such an unfortunate time, and she thought that this might mend her relationship with her sister, which had been a little bit rough because her sister's husband didn't like Thea. However, it only drove them apart even more, which sucked because Dolly, her sister, was such a motherly figure when they were growing up together. In January 1993, New York allowed gay couples to register as domestic partners. Edie said, "Come on, we're doing this, that's the first day and we're gonna go." And Thea said, "Oh, but I have clients that day." And Edie said, "No thank you, you proposed to me 25 years ago, we're not waiting a second longer." So on March 1st, they went up there and they were the 80th couple to get officially signed as domestic partners, which is still not good enough. It's not married, but it's definitely a step. In 1999, she turned 70, and she still felt like she was 20. On the inside, she still felt young, she still felt like she has a lot left in her, and then she had a heart attack. Laurel just commented on my other video. Oh, my sweet friend, I hope I'm doing this book justice. This heart attack was obviously a big scare because that was an issue with both of her parents. That's something that goes back through her family, and it reminded her of her mortality. Again, realizing that time is precious and she wanted to fully devote herself to fighting for gay rights while she had the time to. And then Thea got shingles and had to get rushed to the hospital, and also she had a heart attack. They had an option to where they could give Thea a heart surgery, but they decided against it. They said, "Hey, let's just make the most of the years that we have left together." They decided to make a new normal and just work around everything that was going on, and then her sister got Alzheimer's. This is the most unfortunate couple of years. Which makes sense because that's just what happens when you're older, you know? Like, everybody's getting older in this story, so it only makes sense that they're gonna pass, but it sucks that it all happens so close together. It was really hard to read a lot of these chapters. She went for one final visit, she tried to connect, but when somebody has pretty severe memory loss, it's kind of hard to connect with them. She never got any closure with it. She never got any bonding time where they realized that actually they still love each other after all. In the little memories that she was having, she was happy to have the three of them together. The three siblings got to be together in her head, and that was enough to let Edie know that at least in some world, her sister did still care about all of them, and that was the last time that she saw her. It was just A very unfortunate couple of years. It was really hard to read, and I feel like when I talk about it, it sounds like I'm not taking it seriously. It's just hard to talk about, especially because it's not my story to be telling, and because of that, I can't express it with the sadness that it deserves. But if you do go into this book, just know that those chapters specifically are pretty heartbreaking. It's just one thing after another. I think my next update is going to be my last one. For one thing, because it's 1 a.m., and for another, because we have 5 chapters left. I said there were 23, there are 26. So we're gonna get through that last little bit and then we're gonna call it a night. And I just hope it doesn't take me too long. See you then.
Will not be back for.
It's 2:20 a.m. and I'm very happy to announce that I did finish this book. It took me longer than I was expecting, but I'm not mad about it because this is not the type of story that you should be rushing through. This is the type of story that you should be hanging on to. So let's talk about chapters 21 to 26. I am gonna read pretty directly off of my notes just because it's really late, I need to get to bed. But in chapter 21, she talks about how they were making their final plans, what do they want to do before Thea inevitably passes because it's coming up, things are not looking so good, and they decide they want to go to Paris in the springtime. They want to have this one final adventure together. In 2005, her sister passed away, which means now she's the last one standing out of her immediate family. When Eddie is 77, they get news that Thea needs heart surgery or else she's not gonna make it another year. But they had already agreed that Thea was not going to go back to the hospital and whatever happens is what happens. So instead, Eddie proposes, why don't we go to Canada and get married? Because legally we can get married in Canada even though we can't do it here. And Thea doesn't really want to because it's a lot of work. And she gets sad because that's probably her last plane ride. But at the end of the day, it is a happy event. And in May 2007, they legally became married. They legally are partners for life. Which didn't really change anything with their dynamic. They'd already been living together for 40 plus years, so it's not like that actually changed anything, but it did validate their feelings. It did say, hey, legally, like 2 other people, you are now seen as a couple. A month after Thea's passing, Eddie started to have more heart problems, a little bit of broken heart syndrome, and she said that she was ready to go. You know, she lived a long life, she had her partner through all of it, and now she's ready to move on. But doctors gave her something for her heart. They put a stent in and it collapsed and then her heart stopped, which is a whole other thing. Really scary to think about, really scary to experience, but obviously she ended up surviving. She ended up living a good couple of years. She talked at Thea's memorial, and while it was a sad occasion, she did remind herself that she was grateful to have been with Thea at all. And around this time, the whole court case started to spark up because she was getting taxed for something with her relationship that wouldn't have been taxed if it was a heterosexual relationship. The government wasn't considering their relationship to be valid, and Eddie didn't like that. So she said, you know what? We're gonna sue the entire country. She didn't mind paying taxes, but she didn't want to give money to a government that was focused on hateful discrimination. So she called up an old friend who happened to be an old client of Thea's and was also a really good lawyer. And they started the case, Windsor versus the United States of America. And I'll be honest, I really suck at explaining history. I really suck at explaining politics. I don't understand it. I don't really care to know it. It's something that does not interest me. It's something that does not hold my attention, so I'm not even gonna try to explain the whole case. If that is something you're interested in, I definitely recommend looking it up and looking into it because it really is interesting, and I wish it was something that we had learned about in school, but I do not feel qualified to talk about that whatsoever. But just know that ultimately it was a success. They did win the case, and it was a big landmark thing that led to gay marriage being legalized all over the country. And it was really interesting because when I went into this book, I thought it was going to be focused on this case and focused on all of the legal things that went on and all of the activism and everything that she did that was productive. And instead, almost all of the book was focused on her relationships. And that's why I said I was bored before. I thought it was gonna get into these really big things that she did, but ultimately this is a story of love. This whole book is focused on her relationships. It's focused on the passion that she had for other people and how that fueled the things that she did. Chapter 24 was very short. It was only like 3 pages, and it essentially just said that she was lonely and she would go to a bunch of events, but she would come home and at the end of the day, there's nobody with her in her bed. And she was pretty scared that what if something happens while she's home alone and there's nobody there to take care of her. There's nobody to be there in the night if something happens. I misspoke earlier. I said Thea died in 2007. She died February 5th, 2009. And September 12th, 2017, Eddie passed. It was sudden and it was painless. She had been in the hospital for something and she was about to get discharged and she was ready and she had things lined up. but her body was ready. It's just the way it goes, you know? She was an old lady, she was pushing herself really hard, and it was just time to rest. And Joshua, the other author, emphasizes that she didn't just want this to be about Thea, she also wanted to talk about Judith, her second wife, who was still extremely supportive in such a big part of her life. Because this is when she had made the big difference, and now she's going around, she's doing all of these things, and she had somebody to support her through it all. Judith made Edie feel safe, she took care of her. She wanted one big last love, and she got it with Judith. June 2017 was a really busy Pride month, and they were excited to have some time to hang out in the months that followed it. And then she had some health stuff going on. She ended up in the hospital. Obama called her in the final days before she was supposed to get discharged to say, hey, we support you, we love what you're doing, we hope you get better soon. It just means a lot to feel like what you're doing matters to people that are that big. And a couple days after that, she peacefully passed away. It talks about how Edie and Thea's ashes sit side by side, how she died knowing that she was loved not only by the people around her, not only by Judith and by all of her friends, but also by pretty much the whole queer community. All of these young people who looked up to her as somebody who made such a difference for them, somebody who was such an icon and such a positive role model. Exactly the type of thing that she would have liked to have when she was younger and she didn't have anybody to talk to or anybody to look up to. Now she can be that for so many young people. And she showed that it's possible that even if you are older, you can still make a difference. Your life still matters. It's just such an inspiring story to read. And then the book ends off with a bunch of pictures from her life, going from her childhood all the way up until her final months. And I really appreciated that that was in there, because in my head, this is such a long time ago, but then you see the pictures where, like 1969, that's when they went to Italy, or that's when Stonewall happened, and that's also when my mom was born. And then you think 2009 when her spouse died, and you remember I was alive in 2009. It's so much more relevant than you think it is, and I feel like these pictures really help to connect readers with the time period and to say, hey, that wasn't that long ago. I've seen these pictures all the time because this isn't so distant. This isn't so far away. Overall, I thought this would be super political. I thought it would really be focused on the court case and everything that had to do with that, and I was intimidated because of it. But it was just sharing her whole life story, which, yes, it involved that, but ultimately this is a story of love. It really humanized the whole situation. It showed that while she is an influential person and she did do these gigantic things, she also is just some lady. We don't need to idolize and we don't need to act like her life was perfect. She was just another person, and the circumstances lined up and she happened to do this really great thing. And that's not to devalue the thing that she did. Obviously, that's such a big event, so important for so many people, but by reading this, you can remember that it is possible. You don't have to be super special, you can just be somebody. It's just a really motivating story about love, and I really enjoyed reading it. And now it's 2:30 a.m., so I don't have anything else to say. If you don't know, for all of June, I'm doing videos talking about books written by queer authors, so if you would like to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to this channel, or if you just like my face, you can subscribe to my main channel, riverbxnd, where I post music content, or my Instagram, Spotify, Goodreads, Storygraph, and TikTok, which I'll have linked in the description for you. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.